Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, which we entitled Situating Disability, the Factors and Politics of Disability Exclusion in Philosophy and Beyond. We hope it'll be generative. We hope for audience members to be engaged and asking questions of our panelists, and we look forward. So I will begin by introducing myself. I'm Melinda Hall. I teach in the philosophy department at a small liberal arts college called Stetson University, which is in Florida on the traditional lands of the Seminole and many other marginalized and oppressed tribes that used to people this area. I'm a white woman. I'm in an academic office. I have long brown hair and I'm wearing a black blazer because it is Florida cold, which means that it is 68 degrees outside and I'm freezing. We are really looking forward to this panel, and I wanted to begin, if we have Jonathan, by having Jonathan introduce. Oh, yeah, there we go. You want to introduce yourself as well, and then start with question number one for our panelists?
Sure. I'm Jonathan Flowers. I am an assistant professor at California State University, Northridge. I am a Black man wearing a blue sweater, and I have a mohawk, and I'm wearing black glasses. And it's my pleasure to be here today. Actually, Melinda, could you start with the first question while I bring them up?
Of course, I'm happy to do that. So we wanted to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and briefly situate themselves with response to the topic. Again, that topic is situating disability, the factors and politics of disability exclusion and philosophy and beyond. And I want to proceed in alphabetical order, which puts Robert Chapman as our first respondent.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Can you? Yeah, great. So thanks so much for the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Robert Chapman. I use they them pronouns. I'm a sort of masculine presenting white person. I've got short, kind of graying hair. I'm wearing a brown shirt, and I'm against a green room. There's a small cat I'm kind of cuddling here who's going to be fed soon. That's Esme. She's a small white Siamese kitten. So she might be popping up now and again. So I'm currently a assistant professor of critical neurodiversity studies at Durham University. It's a temporary role. It's for 3 years. It started this September. So that's not actually a philosophy role. I'm in the Institute of Medical Humanities, and I got this role as part of a broader funding bid that was put together by a bunch of people from the institute. Previously, I've worked at Sheffield Hallam University, which is here in the UK as well. I was in the education department, and they have an autism masters. And I've taught at Bristol University and Essex University, where I did my PhD. My background is in philosophy. I did a philosophy undergrad. I did a continental philosophy master's, and then a PhD where I focused on the metaphysics and ethics of autism. And I was interested for that in how conceptions of the autistic thriving and the good life and personhood had been kind of stifled in the race. And that's in philosophy and in society more generally. So I knew I was autistic kind of coming into philosophy, and that was a battle in many ways from the beginning, even to get my topic taken seriously, as I'm sure many other people will have experienced in similar but slightly different ways. And that shapes my experience from the beginning. I might say more about that later, but I also gained new disabilities while as a philosopher. And in a sense, in part because of work. So during the pandemic, at one role I had, we had to go into the classroom with, 40 people in a room. And, that's pretty much guaranteed that there's going to be COVID going around there. But that was it was kind of like that, or, you don't have a job, I guess. I got long COVID from that. It still impacts me now. So this is a whole new both bodily and mental disability, and that did relate precisely to work conditions. Yeah, so this has structured everything about my experience and my work, which is closely connected to that. I will leave it there for now, and we'll elaborate later. Thanks.
Next, we have Jane Dryden.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to hear from all of my co-panelists whose work I've enjoyed both in reading and like also in previous ones of these conferences. So this is really great, and I'm excited to like sit with the cool kids. So my name is Jane Dryden. I'm a white woman with short blonde or pinky, I don't even know at this point. I don't know what you can see. Hair, glasses, long earrings, a black cardigan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an associate professor of philosophy and and interim director of our very new health studies program, which it's one of those things where it's like I'm tempted to be like, yes, haha, I can make it super, super critical. But it's interesting working on these things in committees with other people and the kinds of not compromises, but trying to sort of steer things together. That might come up later in some of my remarks about how philosophers can reach out to people in other disciplines. Anyway, all of this at a small mostly undergraduate university in Eastern Canada, Mount Allison, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm trained in history of philosophy. I wrote my dissertation on Fichte and Hegel. I've come a long way since then. So I still do some work in disability and German idealism, but I also work in issues around vulnerability and autonomy, especially as they relate to our experiences of our body. I've been really interested in gut issues and the way that they are not always thought of as disability from an identity kind of perspective, but like certainly raise issues for accessibility, objection, ableism, what we can and can't speak about in terms of our embodied experiences. And as well, I've gotten really interested in discussions about gut microbiomes and like the issues of selfhood that they raise, just because it's cool. And then in terms of for this roundtable, it's kind of interesting because when I started doing more and more scholarly work on disability, I thought of myself as like a non-disabled ally. But then in doing that, in order to try to be a responsible ally, I got more and more involved in work around accessibility and better disability policies, both at my own institution and in the organizations that I'm involved in. So I was sort of doing all that work. And then during the pandemic started to had time to think, which is always dangerous. Not worried, but sort of thought like, oh, I might be autistic. Like, I think this might be a thing. And then was gobsmacked to find out, not surprised at all to find out I was autistic, but gobsmacked to find out that apparently I also had ADHD, which I was like, really? This isn't how everyone's brain works? Like, have I been working this hard for like, no, anyway, so that's a whole other thing. And it's interesting because when I sort of think back about the ways in which I've sort of gotten along in philosophy, is that I think a lot of the barriers that I've experienced in philosophy and in my academic career, I tend to think they had a lot more to do with my experiences being a first generation academic who didn't really have much in the way of advising. And so periodically made decisions that I'm like looking back now, I'm like, oh, I don't know if those were really strategic. Or also just not having a lot of like money for things. But it's sort of interesting to try to untangle now how many of those were also barriers related to, lack of accommodation, because I didn't even know that it was something I should ask for. So I don't think I'll ever be able to untangle that, but it's kind of redoubled my desire to try to help make things better for the institution that I'm in and the organizations I'm in, especially for those folks who might not know what to ask for. And so can we just make things more more accessible generally? I have rambled for too long. I will stop now.
No, that was great. And I'm so here for and right there with you on the non-disabled ally to disabled academic pipeline. Thank you. So Elvis.
Hello, yeah, I'm Elvis. I have blonde hair, although you can't see it because it's all gone now. I'm putting on a gray blue jumper. I'm African, which means I usually identify as black, but I'm not visibly black because I have albinism, which means I lack melanin. My skin and eyes lack melanin, which is an interesting dimension to colorism, I would say. I'm from Nigeria, from the Benin Kingdom, where all the bronze got stolen from. I'm currently in the UK, somewhere in Surrey, although I work in the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. I am the director of the Center for Global and Comparative Philosophies and a lecturer in African philosophy. So my area of specialization is philosophy, but primarily in terms of comparative African Western philosophy. My lived experiences were very fundamental in defining my research pathway. Thanks a lot to Shelley for organizing the Dialogues of Disability. I did mention in that interview how my research is very personal and professional. Personal because of my lived experiences as an African living within an African community for decades, and yet not feeling like an African because of being a person with albinism, and how that prepared me to do a lot of research on African ontologies and epistemologies, and more specifically, African ontology of personhood. So my PhD dissertation was on African ontologies, looking at how personhood is understood within African philosophy and how that leads to exclusion of persons with disability in general, and more particularly persons with albinism, which was the theme for my 2019 Routledge book, African Philosophy and the Otherness of Albinism. So I do quite a lot of research on African philosophy of disability and ways to sort of promote inclusion within African philosophy, because there's a lot of issues relating to exclusion of disabled persons, issues of sexism, patriarchy, ageism within African philosophy. Well, I don't think there's any philosophical tradition that doesn't have these issues anyway. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's who I am.
Thank you. Next, we have Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Maybe. I'm a white woman, currently in the New York, New Jersey area. I have glasses on, and my long, increasingly graying hair is tied up at the back. I'm wearing a blue turtleneck sweater with a royal blue sweater on top of that. So I came to disability in 2 steps, I guess. First through my daughter, who had a brain aneurysm when she was 12. And it wasn't long after that happened that I noticed the discrimination and exclusion that she, and also us by extension, as her family, were experiencing as a result of her new status as disabled. So we were fighting with the school, experiencing lack of wheelchair access, for example. And I immediately saw the parallels between that kind of exclusion and the exclusions that my husband and I had also faced as an interracial family, and also exclusions that my children had faced as interracial children. Later, I also have become disabled myself as well. So, and I've been thinking about exclusion then because of the way I came to it right from the beginning. So my book, Making and Unmaking Disability, was written on the idea that if we can figure out how disability was constructed, and like Shelley, my view is that disability was constructed all the way down, as a colleague once put it, that is all the way down to impairment, so to speak. Then we'll have a better idea about how to unmake it. And so that's sort of been my approach. In terms of my own career, I've been very lucky in some ways. I've been doing oddball philosophy my entire career. My dissertation included a chapter that drew on pop psychology. I had to kick a guy off my committee so that I could get the dissertation through. And I was lucky to land in a place ultimately that values oddball and interdisciplinary work. However, having ongoing domestic responsibilities because of my family situation has definitely affected the kinds of things that I do and can do as a philosopher. I don't travel very much, for example. Going to conferences is difficult. It's also difficult for me to do things in the evenings, go to, presentations or so on in the evening. So that's my story.
Thank you, Julie. So last, we have Maeve.
Hi, thanks, Melinda. Hello, everybody. I'm also very excited to be here. This is always a great conference. My name's Maeve McEwen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with long brown curly hair. I'm wearing glasses, a black t-shirt and a multicolored cardigan. I'm sitting in front of a bookcase and a white door and an ugly printer. So I am an assistant professor in political theory at Campus Friesland, which is an interdisciplinary liberal arts college at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. But I'm from Belfast, so that's where this accent comes from. My research is on structural injustice, so I have a book coming out in February on that, and also an edited volume, What is Structural Injustice? And I'm also editing a volume on structural injustice in philosophy with MAP, Minorities in Philosophy, for Bloomsbury Academic. And my relationship to this topic is less to do with my research and more to do with my lived experience. So I have epilepsy, and due to my epilepsy, I've experienced indirect and direct discrimination within academia. I guess indirectly, I've had to take time out of my PhD, my postdoc, and jobs. I haven't been able to publish as much as able-bodied colleagues, and I find this to be a real disadvantage on the job market. And I've also been quite vocal about what it's like to live with a hidden disability and work in academia. And like Robert, I've also acquired new things. I've had long COVID, and now I'm on partial sick leave with burnout. But I'm mostly going to focus on the epilepsy today. And I really want to get started on a project looking at the experiences of staff and students with disabilities at my university. That was something I was hoping to do this year. It's probably going to be next year now, but it will depend on having the time and capacity to do that. And that's something I'd like to continue coming back to, this issue of having time to really work on disability inclusion. So that's me.
Thank you so much. So everyone has touched on how disability exclusion in philosophy, variously understood, has affected them. But if there's anything else that anyone would like to add, I'll just give a moment before turning it over to Jonathan for our second question. If anyone would like to add anything about disability exclusion in philosophy, that would be a good time to do it. And then we'll move on with more conversation. This is because you all did perfectly situating yourselves already. So we will continue to the second question.
So our second question is, can you describe the discursive structures and materiality that drive the politics of disability? And I think we are still starting with Robert, which I think this falls squarely into your wheelhouse, given your research interests.
Thank you. So I will start with, I guess, the most obvious thing, which is capitalism. So I guess I see first disablement itself, but also disability oppression and discrimination as really intrinsically related to capitalism, and not to mention interlocking systems of colonialism, imperialism, and so on. And the very basic thought is, I'm sure people here will know this, but under capitalism, each of us is firstly framed as just an individual with sets of abilities which can be like used for production and so forth. And each of us gets ordered and ranked increasingly in relation to norms more as capitalism intensifies. And this just happens more and more and more. And as new technologies arise to do this. And this norm itself is not just a natural one. These abilities, like, which ones are valued and are not natural, but they're related to things like, they're at least significantly determined by the specifics of the economy, the state of technology, and so forth at any given time. And this really filters through into everything, not just work. Work is an obvious place, but how everything is organized, from family units of social reproduction, from school curriculums to how we're tested at school, to social norms and so forth, and including, of course, in philosophy and academia. A concept I found really helpful for thinking about my own experience in relation to this was the concept of extractive abandonment. This is from Beatrice Adler-Bolton and Artie Vierkant in their recent book, Health Communism. And it's basically, it's about how under capitalism, it will extract whatever it can from you, especially if you're positioned as part of a kind of what some people have called a surplus class, the people who are shut out of work and so forth in the system, and then abandon you as soon as it can. So essentially, if you're born disabled, if you're born with a disability in some sense, or born in that kind of position, instantly there'll be whole kind of industries of management, which are there to kind of extract from you in various ways and manage you and try and normalize you in various ways and so forth. But if you're not born disabled or into that kind of position, you will be positioned as someone who can work, and that you'll be extracted from in a different way until you get kind of burnout or cognitive decline or like depression or whatever else, until that basically destroys you in some way or another. And then you become disabled, and capitalism will kind of, it kind of chews you up and spits you out, right? So that's the basic thought. And this is very much something that you see in philosophy, of course, as well, and academia, and how it treats us. I mentioned earlier I got long COVID at one workplace. That was a temporary job. It was I won't say much about where it was or anything, but like, it was a temporary role. It was a short-term contract, but I had to do that because like you've got to work to survive, if you can work. And then you kind of get this job, and it's really dangerous, it's really risky, but you're kind of forced into that position. I'm someone who's at high risk and stuff like that. I've had a bunch of lung operations in the past as well. And I only have like one fully working lung, basically. So this was a big risk. In that case, it was definitely going to happen. And it's this kind of form of extractive abandonment. I was there, I was working, you're being exploited, then you get ill, and then your contract is not renewed because you can't work as much anymore. And that's, again, I want to be clear, I've had really great colleagues, and this is nothing about any specific colleague or anything like that, who have been really lovely, but it's about how the system works and how these institutions work. And this is just one version of something that happens to everyone in the system. If you're not disabled yet, of course you will be at some point, right? There will be cognitive decline, there will be X, Y, or Z. So yeah, it's a kind of system which both it produces disablement as well as excluding disabled people, and that's just built into the logics of the system. Yeah, I'll leave that on. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. Jane, do you want to answer next?
Hi, yeah, sure, thanks. I had in my head a kind of countdown timer for this roundtable before someone sort of brought up capitalism. I was like, tick, tick, tick. So I'm like, Robert, like, right on. I think lots of other people on the panel are going to say more insightful things, but I wanted to just really underscore again that point about the way the individualization of health, the way that disability is individualized, that works in all the way that Robert mentioned. It also sort of works thinking about in the context, especially of the pandemic, the way that things like keeping oneself quote unquote safe, whatever safe means, kind of protecting oneself, all of that kind of with so rapidly the move to normal, all of the kinds of public and shared protections went away. The kind of sense of shared responsibility for protection went away, leaving it very much up to individuals to kind of take their own things. And then, of course, once those individuals become sick, it is then on those individuals as individuals to like get themselves sorted out or not. And looking at some of the processes by which my own institution has been dealing with short and long-term disability, like again, really back up to that kind of point about extractivism that Robert mentioned earlier. Extractive abandonment is exactly right. So that's been one of the things, and that individualism as well, I think, gets treated into a kind of binary politics about needing to fit into a certain box to kind of count as disabled and get the legal accommodations to which you might not even get them, but you even sort of have to even have a hope of asking them. Those accommodation processes are really gatekeeping-y, as many folks have pointed out. In my region, like most of us don't, I live in a rural area where most of us don't even have doctors. And so I still have a family doctor, but his work is 45 minutes away through like rural New Brunswick roads. And so in practice, I don't have access to a doctor when it's winter, because it wouldn't be safe to drive out there. So yeah, I mean, this kind of gets connected to things that I want to say later on in the roundtable about, again, the need to sort of like fight for a better world for like all sorts of different body minds and move away from the kind of accommodationist logic that of course Shelley has written so extensively about. I think the only other thing that I just wanted to add before other people say very smart, insightful things is the issue of time and crip time and expectations around energy. If folks haven't seen it, the collection that came out in South Atlantic Quarterly back in 2021 on crip temporalities had just some really, really fantastic and useful writing about crip time. Margaret Price has a co-written piece in there where she and a collaborator whose name has temporarily got in my head kind of interviewed a number of disabled faculty just about the sheer amount of time that it takes to get accommodations, implement accommodations, see what's actually working, kind of get back, and how that just adds a whole extra dimension to the work. And that is not just the case in academia or in philosophy, but kind of for anyone in the workplace or in the education system at all. And oh, sorry, one more thing. I'm so sorry. There's also some really lovely research about the sort of perception about how people can either be perceived as professionals in their own right or as recipients of service, but kind of not both at the same time, which sort of further makes it difficult to navigate those spaces. And I'll turn it over.
Next we have Elvis, and I'm actually really interested to hear what you have to say, given your unique philosophical perspective.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I mean, I would think about the discursive structure of the policies of disability within philosophy, or the power relations of disability within philosophy, from my own situatedness as an African. I think we often think of racism, which obviously was an unavoidable effect of colonization, in terms of colorism, when we talk about anti-Black racism, or corporeality, but not often in terms, as I would think we should do, of ableism. because I think colonization and racism is very fundamentally the denial of cognitive functions to a people, their ability to think. When we look at the works of Kant or Hegel or Voltaire or these dead white guys, what you find is very strong emphasis on cognitive disorder among the people that were colonized. They cannot think, they cannot produce philosophy. So there's a lot of binaries between logical and pre-logical, civilized and primitive, and so on and so forth. And I think that had a huge impact on African philosophy. I mean, from the 1950s to the 1990s, when African philosophy became part of academic spaces, African philosophers spent more than 40, 50 years just defending that there is African philosophy, defending their own ability to think. And I think that in many ways shows this sort of power relations in the production of philosophy. And we find that till date. I'm an African philosopher, but I have to sort of, in a sense, keep proving my ability to think within my space, within my horizon, and keep proving that the sort of philosophical systems that have been produced within my horizon has impacted my being as a person with disability. So I think it begins with this inherent denial of cognitive functions to a people within colonization and racism. But even more problematic is that within the denied philosophical systems, there is still exclusion going on. So within African philosophy, there's still exclusion of persons with disability, there's still sexism, there's still patriarchy, and so on and so forth. So I think this politics hasn't ended. It's ongoing. There's a lot of effort to overcome it. African philosophy is very lived and practiced. It's something that permeates everyday life within an African place, in names, adages, proverbs, oral philosophy, symbolic philosophy. I mean, the bronze sculptures that were looted from my place in the late 1800s into UK and other places were not just aesthetic symbols or sculptures. They had very strong ontological meanings as well. But thinking about African philosophy as an academic discipline is still very much a struggle. There's still a lot of marginalization of non-Western philosophies, and you find that struggle to make it part of mainstream philosophy, first of all, and then show how that impacts disability, and in my case, albinism, is really a huge problem to grapple with. I mean, over the last 30, 40 years, there's been so many articles and books and handbooks on African philosophy, but how many universities have assimilated this as part of their curriculum? I'm in London. I'm fortunate to be at the School of Oriental and African Studies because its focus is on Oriental and African Studies, although it has a quite weird history when it began. But that gives me a space to think and to write about African philosophy and, by implication, African philosophy of disability. But other than that, it's hard to find the space to do that, globally speaking. And I think that is problematic generally for philosophy and the sort of power relations that take place within philosophy. Yeah.
Thank you, Elvis. Julie?
Thank you. So I'm privileged to follow Elvis, and I can reinforce much of what Elvis has just said. I started teaching African philosophy myself back in the 1990s. I started doing it in graduate school, And I'll never forget one of my colleagues when I first, not where I am now, but at another place, when I first introduced a course was introducing a course in African philosophy. He said there was no such thing, right? And the first textbook I used to teach African philosophy at that institution, the course got passed anyway, in spite of what he said. But anyway, was the whole book was about what is African philosophy, because there was, that was the central question at the time. And I was lucky, again, to have been hired where I am today to teach African philosophy. So I introduced the courses here at Lehman College, CUNY, when I first came. And I have found, like Elvis, I found it a very fruitful area to help us to think through philosophy as well as disability, and I wove thinking about African philosophy into my book into all of my other work, because it helps us to see the ways in which our own views and many of the concepts that we take for granted, like the concept of disability and impairment, concepts of disability and impairment, for example, are structured and particular to particular cultures and places in the world. My book interweaves thinking about the ways in which capitalism has structured. I invented the concept of disability. That's my view. That it originally invented it, and then, but that disability has also been invented at other levels. So that's the point of the three bodies, sort of three levels of embodiment. And African philosophy is particularly helpful in seeing how the other layers are constructed by Western society. And I think that the pandemic really exposed many of the ways in which it's structured. So I see inflation, for example, our current experience of inflation as a reassertion of power by the capitalists who had lost some power in their battle with workers during the pandemic. But how do you make workers hungry again? Well, you raise the prices on food in particular. Also, one of this research, more recent research has shown that the only social factor that researchers have found was associated with a high infection and death rate during the COVID-19 pandemic was intellectual disability. And so I think that fact really helps to show how the pandemic exposed many of our society's structures of disability. And so in some of my other work more recently has been exploring how home is constructed and how that affected the way in which COVID-19 impacted different populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Maeve?
Thanks. Yeah. So I looked into some of the numbers on this in terms of the material politics of people living with epilepsy. And in the UK, only 34% of people with epilepsy are employed, compared to 76% of the adult population in general. And this is one of the lowest employment rates among disabled people. And also people with epilepsy earn 11.8% less than non-disabled workers. So why? Well, the Institute for Employment Studies found this was because of general misconceptions and misunderstandings about the condition. So even though it's one of the most common disabilities that there is, it's very widely misunderstood. So it's mostly associated with flashing lights. but actually only 3 to 5% of people with epilepsy are photosensitive. For everybody else, they have different triggers for their seizures. It's also associated with tonic-clonic seizures, what used to be known as grand mal seizures. But there's actually a whole range of different types of seizures, and everyone's seizure frequency is completely different. Also, it doesn't seem to be known that most people's epilepsy can actually be controlled with medication. So most people with epilepsy can work in most workplaces without any real problems. And I think this problem of lack of understanding is generalizable to many different disabilities. People are often uninformed or misinformed about disability, and this creates these discursive structures that then reinforce the material exclusions that disabled people are experiencing. So if I think about this in terms of the structural injustice framework that I work in, it's the combination of ideas or ideology, our customs and norms, our habits, and the material structures that all combine together to exclude, marginalize, and oppress certain communities, and in this case, people with disabilities. So I think we need to understand both the ideas that are happening here, the material realities, and how they're connected to each other. Yeah.
Thank you all. And I think I have a bit of a follow-up. Julie, you started mentioning COVID in your response. And so one of the things that I would like to ask the panel is, did the pandemic, on your view, change or transform the discursive structures and materiality that drive the politics of disability, or did it expose and tighten them, or did it do something else? And I think we might go in the same order of panelists, starting with Robert.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, as was mentioned, right? So the pandemic was really bad for disabled people in many ways, right? So people with intellectual disability being among the highest death rates, and that relates, of course, to people being incarcerated in institutions where you can't escape it if the virus catches in there, and so many other factors, right? In many ways, disabled people have been abandoned during the pandemic, just as at any other point. At the same time, there was a kind of paradox here, because the pandemic it has opened up, or did for a while at least, open up possibilities or possible ways of organizing in various ways that were more inclusive for disabled people. I mean, the most obvious one, of course, is like, all this technology suddenly being used, allowing people to work from home or to access conferences and things like that. That at least gave us a glimpse of a different kind of way of organizing things, which people have actually stopped doing far more now, right? People were masking for a while, now people aren't masking, right? People have stopped. Lots of this kind of came from it was kind of top-down stuff from companies and governments and stuff like that. But you also see really important kind of bottom-up kind of things arising. Many mutual aid groups, which were very local, arose spontaneously. On the roads I lived in for at least a lot of the lockdowns here in the UK, it was a small road in a city in Bristol with small terrace house, 2-bedroom houses. And a WhatsApp group appeared for the street. Well, it didn't appear, it kind of arose and people were joined. And, there was lots of kind of people going and getting medications for people who need it and who couldn't leave the house. Lots of people helping each other with their shopping and stuff like that. And this was like a temporary thing, which just happened because people were forced into this and had to kind of work together. Lots of people just hadn't really met their neighbors before that, right? The world we live in kind of really separates us and alienates us from each other. And suddenly people were discovering community in a way. And I think that it gives a glimpse of the kind of different ways of organizing and of possible futures, which are actually much more hopeful. Now, that said, now we have had this kind of like this idea that the pandemic has ended, which is false, by the way. I was in hospital 2 months ago because I got COVID again. It's false that the pandemic has ended, in my view. But at least we're acting like it's ended. And everyone's kind of going back to work and stuff like that, or everyone who is still able to work is going back to work and so on. And we don't have lockdowns anymore and so forth. And instantly, a lot of those possibilities have just shut off again. And I guess, again, slightly pessimistic maybe, but it comes back to what I was saying earlier. It's about how capitalism works. It's not designed to fulfill our human needs to thrive and to flourish. It's designed, for other purposes. So kind of, yeah, there's some hope that the pandemic has given us shown us other possible ways of organizing in certain ways, and I think it shows we can do that. And often we're taught to think we can't do that, like that humans just have to be like this hyper individualistic kind of way of living and so on. But actually, it shows we can change pretty quickly. So yeah, there is hope there too. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Jane?
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate the follow-up. I mentioned earlier in my response, like the kind of binary thinking between you can either be someone who might be in need of service or accommodation, or you can be a professional and not both. And I really see a lot of that binary thinking going on in the kind of move back to quote unquote normal. I mean, I'm assuming that with this group, with this conference, normal is always understood to be like scare quoted and little asterisks and like, what even is this? But I find it really striking in the sort of like rush to go back to normal, the sort of discard of any kind of sense that we might still owe something to each other. I'm one of the few people I know at my institution who still regularly wears a mask. I'm one of the few, like when I often choose not to go to academic conferences if I don't think I'm going to be able to, if like just the sort of setup around meals and lodging and everything is such that I don't think I'm going to be able to be safe. When I do go to conferences, I wear a mask for sessions and then I go to my room and get takeout. Or if it's summer, I eat outside, which is great. Summer conferences, eating outside, good times. But I find it really strange that in trying to work with institutions, organizations, conferences, so forth, to kind of mention like, oh, hey, the pandemic is ongoing. Everyone is like, well, we don't want to go all the way back to lockdown. And I felt so isolated back in lockdown. And that binary thinking of like, either we have to be in our isolated, either we have to be fully this or nothing at all. I find really striking, and I'm seeing amongst even people who I really like as friends and colleagues. And it feels like a kind of constant gaslighting. And so in terms of the kinds of forces, they're all there. They're like the sort of the forces going on, sort of creating disability, those individualizing forces, they're all there. But I think my own thinking about it has had to be more, sometimes I have this Pollyanna-ish sort of like, well, surely if people have it explained to them, they'll like, surely. And that's it's really gotten taken away from me. But again, I don't want to, again, it's that in myself find that I have the individualizing tendency to want to get annoyed at particular people, whereas I recognize like, what are the messages we're getting from public health? They're also bad. Like, so it's, so I think, I don't know, it's really interesting. Someone should write stuff about this or something.
Thanks, Jane. And somebody should write something about this. Probably none of us because we're all super busy. But so next we've got Elvis.
Yeah, I think one thing that came with the pandemic was particularly for us as teachers was an increased use of technologies, right? But I find that it is a struggle within the politics of the institution to understand that there is a very sort of specific struggle with the use of technologies for persons with disabilities. And that was for me my experience with the pandemic. I had to it was within the pandemic in 2020 when it just started that I moved to the UK, and I had to teach a lot online via Zoom and do a lot of marking online. I mean, everything moved to something you had to do electronically. I'm a person with albinism. My eyesight are quite terrible. I have to look very close to the screen to be able to see anything. And this was very, very difficult in terms of teaching and basically doing my work as an academic. I struggle enough to write papers and to type them out and to publish and all of that. But this was sort of an added burden, I would say. But what I think is really the sort of discursive structure or materiality is that I think with the institution found it hard to understand. I mean, there are still sort of equipments or technologies I've requested for that would make things easier. And I have been made to go through some tedious assessment processes. I still have one next week before I can get some. So you get one today, you get one 6 months time, you get another 1 year time, and it's been that way. So I've had to stay on just today as an example. I've been working from home, and so I've been looking at the screen from maybe 9 to about 1, and I know how that feels with my eyesight. And it's more frustrating that I cannot explain it in very clear terms to someone who do not experience it. So I think for me, particularly in terms of anyone within philosophy who suffers from visual impairment, it's having to publish and teach with technologies that are not very visually friendly, I would say. And that remains a problem. You really don't have a choice in the matter, do you? You have to look at the screen. You have to grade your scripts. You have to teach online. You have to read students' messages on chat. I have to keep sort of taking photos of the chat to be able to see Zoom and see what's going on. And yeah, it's a struggle to be able to make that reasonably clear to an employer why you, for example, need to do this way, or you need so and so technologies to be able to get things done. And I think the pandemic really did expose that. That's my take. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Elvis. Julie?
As I mentioned, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is the relation between home and the effects of COVID. So we all got this stay-at-home order, right? Well, how well that works depends on your home, right? So I've done a couple of presentations on the way in which home has constructed the effects of COVID. So looking at homelessness, unhoused versus housed, of course, there were very high rates of infection and death among people who are experiencing homelessness who were staying in shelters. Less so much people experiencing homelessness who are unhoused. Actually, they did better in California, for example. We also saw higher rates of infection and death among people experiencing, I can't remember, I was trying to think of the term and I can't think of the term, but experiencing more crowded homes. So in large cities where you have many people in the family living in the same small apartment, using the same bathroom, especially so that we also see, of course, as Robert mentioned, one of the explanations for the high rate of infection and death among people with intellectual disabilities was that they live in congregate housing situations and also some research suggested it was because they also often have a lot of personal care attendants. And so, and also among the elderly, we saw very high rates, of course, of infection and death among elderly people and disabled people in nursing homes and in congregate care institutions. And so I think that, but I think it just exposed, right? It's these home problems, as I call them, existed before, right? They just weren't exposed in the same way as they were during the pandemic. And so that's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, is thinking of these as various kinds of homelessness in a sort of expanded sense, because in many cases, people with disabilities, elderly people, are living in homes that they don't really want to be living in, right? And so in that sense, they're not exactly unhoused, but they're housed in ways they would prefer not to be, right? And so it's a kind of homelessness. So I've been thinking a lot about homelessness and disability and COVID-19.
Thank you, Julie. Maeve?
Thanks, yeah. I mean, what I had to say kind of overlaps with what's been said already. So, on the one hand, COVID did expose the politics of disability in a very stark way, right? Because people who were already victims of structural injustice were more likely to die from COVID, and that included people with intellectual disabilities, elderly people in care homes, people of color, people living in crowded living conditions. And it became clear, who was considered a valuable member of society and who wasn't, right? COVID really exposed that. On the other hand, there were changes, right? And as we've heard, there have been some positive changes. And I think some of those, from a disability perspective, are things like more flexible working, being able to work from home. It's now very difficult to get people back into the office because everyone has realized that actually flexible working can be good for them. Working from home can be beneficial. It can be especially beneficial if you have a medical condition or a disability, because you've got everything you need at home. You can take naps if you need to, like I do. You can do whatever it is you need to do, assuming, of course, like it's just been pointed out, your house can accommodate your needs and is, a decent space to be in. And things like this, online conferences have become normalized, and that's great for a lot of people living with disabilities, because you don't have to travel. It's much easier to attend. The bar for attendance is so much lower. We now have hybrid working as a norm. I have so many online meetings now, which makes things easier. Although, as Elvis has pointed out, for some people, like the visually impaired, that's not such a good thing, right? So it's not, some of these things are not straightforwardly positives, but they're also, they are changes that we've seen. However, we did see the world shift in a way to accommodate disability for a kind of brief moment during COVID, and so much of that has disappeared, right? So we've got flexible working now, that kind of thing, but, not masking. We could have learned to wear a mask when we're sick to not infect other people, and we have not learned that from COVID. We've just gone back to going around being sick and infecting other people as the norm. And I think it shows, social practices are extremely difficult to change. They have to be useful to a lot of people to change things like flexible working. But if they're benefiting minorities, they're not going to change as easily. So I think, COVID has a very mixed legacy in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Melinda for the next set of questions.
Thank you. Yeah, and we had a question in the Q&A box that both addresses some parts of what we've been pointing toward and points ahead to the next question. So I wanted, as we're about halfway through, to briefly introduce that question out loud and then invite anyone to respond. So this question is coming from Hypatia. Hypatia writes, do you think looking at academia as a form of quote unquote job instead of a type of leisurely activity is more excluding or including. They write in parentheses, at least for me, academia seemed always to be a way to escape having a typical job/work, not a way of acquiring one, but maybe for others, it might seem like the opposite. So I'd like to open that to anyone to respond to. And again, I think it's a good bridge between some of the things we've been discussing and what I plan to ask next. So yeah, Jane.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, Julie was ready before I.
Okay.
I'll
So
go after.
okay, Julie's ready, and then Jane.
So I mean, I guess I want to say in a way both are true. My father used to joke that that I became an academic so I would never have to get a real job. And there's some truth to that. I mean, it's certainly a privilege, especially for me. I look at our adjuncts, one adjunct I know is teaching 15 classes just to get by in New York. They're on the trains running from this institution to that institution. The economist Guy Standing talks about the precariat and the way in which capitalism has created this class of precarious workers. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. Also, working from home sounds great, but we also have to keep in mind the surveillance technologies that they now use. So my sister-in-law used to work for a medical insurance company processing forms, and she had the privilege, this was before the pandemic, of working at home on Fridays, and she had a 2-hour commute, so she took advantage of that. But the computer program that she had to use tracked her keystrokes, right? So she would not even text me during work because the computer system tracked her productivity while she was at home. And the company said that if she didn't keep up her productivity, they were going to take away her privilege of working at home on Fridays. So the kind of surveillance technology that gets used today, I think, can also make working from home a kind of prison as well. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll keep my comment super back, and it's just a book shout out to a book that I read early during a sabbatical and was so helpful. And it's Sarah Jaffe's book, Work Won't Love You Back. It's so good. I mean, the title, I think it says a lot of it. She draws on work by Kathy Weeks, a labor sociologist, which is also really, really good in its own right. But one of the things I really appreciate about the book Work Won't Love You Back is there's a chapter on academia, which mostly focuses on the situation of part-time and precarious academics. It's well worth reading, very important. Also, there's chapters on the work done by fine artists and the work done by teachers in the K-12 system, which goes through really important questions about when you feel like your work is your vocation, what are the ways in which that labor, what are the ways in which that can get taken advantage of in really problematic ways. And then as well, there's a chapter on nonprofits. Shelley, yes, I'll put the title in the chat. There's a chapter on nonprofits, which goes through the exploitation so often experienced by people working for nonprofits, on tight shoestrings, which again, and the theme throughout a lot of them is like, when you feel really invested in your work because it's really interesting, it's your vocation, like you like it for its own sake a lot of the time. And yet at the end of the day, like it's still work, it's still being done in a capitalist system that's going to kind of like extract what it can from you. And I think that Sarah Jaffe, through the interviews that she does with people, just so beautifully like highlights a lot of the sort of tensions there. And I'll put the title in the chat.
Thank you so much to you both. And this is just so wonderful. I've really appreciated all the answers and things that the panelists have said. And I'm also thinking back to when I suggested having 9 questions for this panel, and Jonathan very gently said, I think we only have time for 5. So I think that he was right. So I have another question, 2 questions actually in the Q&A box. One, I think I'll insert in just a few minutes, depending on how this continues. And then the other one, I think we'll save back until we have more general audience Q&A. So thank you very much. The third sort of question that we circulated to panelists prior to this session was as follows, and I introduced 2 different ways of articulating it, trying to get at different elements of this question. The first way of articulating this question is, what forces would you say regulate the relationship between disability and philosophy as an academic enterprise? The second way of articulating this question is, how would you introduce the story of disability's exclusion in philosophy to a non-philosopher? And to me, I think these questions are sort of heading toward the same sort of destination, but different ways of thinking through it. So I want to invite the panelists to respond to whichever version makes the most sense to them. And we'll again move alphabetically. So to begin, I'm going to ask Robert.
Thanks. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking more about how to introduce the story to a non-philosopher. And one way of thinking about it, which only really covers a very tiny part of it, is that to think, what is the process of going to study philosophy like as a student, and what do you learn there, and what are you made ignorant of? And in a really important sense, I think if you do a, say, undergraduate degree in philosophy, you will, if anything, become more ignorant about disability over that time, or at least there's a fair chance you will. Certainly in my undergraduate degree, which was in many ways a good degree, it was a philosophy degree, but there were so many things. Like, we would learn lots about philosophers without even learning that they were eugenicists, for example. So I don't know how widely it's taught elsewhere, but here in England, like, Bertrand Russell is still widely taught. He's like a sort of hero of British philosophy. And I was shocked then, like, when I later, after my degree, just completely independently found out that once he suggested that the state should hand out procreation tickets, and that it should divide people up using a color code system, and it should find people who procreated with the wrong people, right? And I felt like cheated. Like, we pay all this money for university, we study for years, and this is like a really vital bit of information about this philosopher to me. And not just about philosophers, of course, but about philosophies as well. To give one more example, in a standard philosophy of mind course, or in you'll learn about things like, can you hear me?
Yes, your audio's catching up again now. Yeah, go ahead.
Good, thanks, thank you. So yeah, philosophy of mind, you'll learn about things like your Cartesian dualism and behaviorism and functionalism and all these, and they're kind of presented usually as just these like theories that have got some things going for them and some abstract problems, and then you can kind of pick or choose from them. And again, I didn't learn anything about the politics and sort of histories and surrounding the rise of these theories when I was studying as an undergraduate. And then as I learned more about that later, and again independently, I realized they were all deeply political. So just to give one example, behaviorism as a philosophy of mind, it arose, it was intimately intertwined with its main proponents were talking about how we could use this to control population, to control the desires of populations by using behaviorism. That was kind of what the theory was about. It wasn't just some kind of abstract philosophy of mind, right? It was intimately intertwined with this. And then as a research program, it was funded because of this. It was funded by big organizations, like, and even including the CIA invested lots of money in behaviorism, precisely, and also to control disabled people, to try and normalize disabled people. So it's actually, I see it as kind of a mechanism of control. But if you just do a philosophy degree, you'll probably learn about behaviorism, and you might even come out of that degree kind of going, yeah, I'm a behaviorist. I think behaviorism is a good theory. if you happen to prefer it to the other ones. But ultimately, you in many ways be more ignorant than if you had not learnt about it, right? So I think in some sense, our philosophy programs, and if you to explain this to a non-philosopher, if you study a degree, at least in many places, I hope more places are changing now, but you will be more ignorant when you leave about disability in certain ways than when you arrived, and that's before we even get to Peter Singer and bioethics and eugenics and all that stuff. But yeah, so yeah, so in a sense, like philosophies are kind of like ignorance producing factories, and of course that goes for research as well as students.
Thank you very much. I loved your answer there. And the sort of depoliticization or neutralization of philosophy is so active. It requires a lot of work actually to hide all of these things, I think, and we're doing that, in different ways, and not, or maybe just not challenging it, not being active and politicizing. Thank you so much. And then Jane, would you like to answer at this time?
Sure, yeah. I just saw Jonathan's comment in the chat, and just philosophy is an ignorance producing factory is amazing, and I want that on a t-shirt. So there's lots and lots of things that I could say, but I wanted to sort of keep a little bit focused. And I think one of the things, like a lot of the work I've done has been working with colleagues in other disciplines as well. And I do think a lot of things are shared around academia, but there's something that when I think about what's distinctive about philosophy, again, individualization is a big thing. There was research that came out in 2015, and I got the link, putting the link in the chat, about a correlation between sort of belief in individual like brilliance and talent versus sort of like disciplinary expectations around like hard work and teamwork and that kind of thing. And they found that in disciplines where the emphasis is more on individual brilliance and talent, shockingly, way fewer women, way fewer people of color, so on and so forth. And if you look at the graph, like philosophy within the humanities is just like it's way off on its own in ways that won't be surprising anyone here. Christine Battersby in aesthetics has really good work on the sort of individualization of genius and the kind of work that does that then obscures contextual factors, structural factors, so on and so forth. And I just think philosophy is one of the disciplines where, because there's so much emphasis on what your brain is doing all by itself, and so much emphasis on, well, what talent do you have? What potential do you have? Like potential, whatever that is. And it's so easy to write someone off as, well, they're just not that good at philosophy. Like they just can't cut it. Like they're just not fit for it. As opposed to asking about structural conditions, the availability of supports, the sort of like, oh, well, there's only one job in your field and it's in a place where you would never be able to get healthcare. So, or like you would never be able to move to with your partner if you're queer, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder sometimes, I mean, I don't know, like, I think there's lots of people trying to chip away at that with philosophy. But I wonder sometimes if philosophy was a discipline in which we encouraged more and more collaboration in our writing, in our work, if that would change a little bit. I'm thinking about, I've sort of only just recently started to write things in collaboration with others. And it's really nice how like you things that you're sort of worried about your strengths and weaknesses in philosophy, like when you work with others, then they're sort of, they kind of become complementary. And I just, anyway, I just think that's something so distinctive of philosophy, that emphasis on the individual, that insistence on individual talent. So that's my piece.
Thank you so much. Next, Elvis, if you'd like to answer.
Yeah, I think Robert and Jane did cover it well, but just to add a bit, I mean, again, my apologies, but I will keep asking which philosophy and who actually is a non-philosopher. But I will want to think that we are, in this sense, assuming, yeah, we're talking about mainstream academic philosophy, which is mainstream European Greek originated philosophy. And how I would introduce the exclusion of disability in philosophy to a non-philosopher is to simply give the advice of do not read any philosophy text without thinking about the context. How do we, for example, understand Plato's philosophy or Aristotle's philosophy without thinking about Greek myth, for example? The idea, for example, that Athena, where Greek philosophy thrived, is Zeus' daughter conceived without a woman. The very idea that the woman is not needed for anything. And the very idea that only reason thrives and not emotions. How do we understand Descartes' cogito ergo sum without thinking about the strong binary between mind and body? And so basically paying close attention to the binaries and dichotomies that are very much ingrained into philosophical texts, and how philosophy is primarily understood within the Western discourse as a male, rational, white discipline, rather than one that is embodied, that is emotional, that emerges from place and context, and how that can in many ways become excluding to not just persons with disability, but all sort of genders and basically all sort of selves and traditions. So again, it's what I do within the BA World Philosophies program, draw the attention of students to the context in which philosophy has been produced, the reason for producing certain philosophy, and basically making it clear that philosophy isn't always armchair, stargazing, abstract, but very carefully orchestrated for specific purposes. And once we have that in mind, then we're able to quickly see the ableism and the exclusion that lies within it.
Thank you so very much. Julie.
Just to draw on what you were just saying, Elvis. I mean, philosophy is the gatekeeper of rationality, right? Western philosophy, I think, very much sees itself as the gatekeeper of rationality. And so anybody, as you were saying earlier, Elvis, about who supposedly has and doesn't have rationality, you know, and therefore is or isn't able to do philosophy. And that affects lots of people, including people with disabilities, especially if we add on the phenomenon in disability studies that's often called disability spread, right? Which is the idea that if once a person is perceived by a non-disabled person to be disabled, then they must be disabled in all kinds of ways, right? Disability is like disability spreads over their whole identity. And so then they couldn't possibly do philosophy. You know, people in wheelchairs who use wheelchairs joke that you know, that people think that not just that they can't walk, but they must be intellectually disabled or have this disability or that disability as well, right? And so that and the appeal to supposedly universal reason, right, in philosophy, as others have mentioned, you know, the lack of context. Susan Babbitt, Rob Wilson recently published an article in which he talked about the silence about disability in philosophy, in part because of the failure to take seriously the contexts that make reasons reasonable. As Susan Babbitt, the late Susan Babbitt, who was a colleague of ours in graduate school, talked about. And when disability does get mentioned in philosophy, we often wish they would say less rather than more, because it's often by people who are arguing for various sorts of eugenics and so on. And so so I those were the thoughts that I about how philosophy constructs the exclusion of disabled people. And today, after having done African philosophy for many years, and my husband and I were just talking about this the other day. He's not a philosopher anymore, but he has a PhD like me. And about how getting out of your culture can help you to see how many of the views expressed in philosophy are just assumptions, presumptions, presuppositions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This is just absolutely wonderful. Maeve, would you like to speak to this before we move on to our final prepared question?
Thanks. Yeah, I actually have so much to say about this. I wanted to talk about it in terms of how difficult it is to be a disabled philosopher because of the working conditions. So for me, like, my seizures are triggered by stress mostly, and sleep deprivation, and trying to get a job in philosophy and trying to work as a philosopher is just so stressful. So there are external stressors, which are the job market. The job market is absolutely saturated. There are so many people with a PhD in philosophy and so few jobs. It's incredibly competitive. You're competing with your friends, people but also people way further up the career ladder who have a much better chance than you of getting a job. You have the peer review process, which can be absolutely brutal. And it's a bit of a lottery in terms of getting published, and you need to publish in order to get a job. You have to network a lot, and that can be difficult for people with disabilities, can be difficult if you can't travel. You have to attend conferences, which is difficult for the same reasons. But there are also internal stressors, things like imposter syndrome, feeling like you're not good enough, feeling like you don't belong because you're disabled, when everybody else is able-bodied. And the norm of productivity, which you can't live up to a lot of the time if you have any kind of disability. And this norm of constant productivity is so crucial to the philosophy profession at the moment and all of academia. But, we're just expected to constantly produce new material, new journal articles, new books. And this is a fundamentally ableist norm, because so many people with disabilities just cannot keep up with that. It just doesn't account for crip time, which is, the time that you need to manage your disability, to go to your doctor's appointments, to get your prescriptions, to deal with whatever sort of accommodations you have to deal with, but also the time you might need to take away from your job because you're not well, or you manage your disability somehow. You just can't keep up with this productivity imperative that we have in the profession right now. There's also the issue of moving for work. So I've had many different jobs since I finished my PhD. I'm sure everyone here is probably in the same boat. Now I'm living in the Netherlands. It was a big decision. Do I want to move abroad to a country where I don't have a support network? I don't have people around me who can help if I have a seizure. What am I going to do about doctors? I have to leave my neurologists behind and find new doctors. How am I going to navigate this healthcare system? How am I going to get my medications? That's a really big thing to deal with. There's also issues like in terms of getting a job, having gaps in your CV if you've taken time out because you're ill. There have been gaps in my funding because I've been having seizures. So during my PhD, I had a massive seizure, I had a head injury, and I had to take 8 months out, and my funding was stopped by my institution, which was a complete nightmare. They tried to stop my funding in one of my postdocs. So, how are you going to continue in the profession if you're not getting paid, right? There's also a real lack of support for disabled staff. So I knew there was a lack of support for disabled students when I was a student, but there are generally student services that you can access. However, I find that as a member of staff, there actually is not very much support at all. And I think I don't know if this applies in all countries, But you know, you don't have the same sort of student disability support officer that you can go to. Instead, you're kind of on your own, and you've got to navigate this bureaucracy on your own. There's also the issue of stigma that I mentioned earlier, a real misunderstanding of different medical conditions. And this is a problem in philosophy in particular. Like Jane was saying, you know, you're expected to be this just disembodied genius, you know. So once you disclose to people that actually you've got some sort of disability, it sort of casts out on your ability to be that person. This idea of disability spread, oh, if you've got this one thing, there must be all sorts of things wrong with you, which means you cannot be a philosopher. And then you have to deal with this stress of disclosure. Do I disclose this to my fellow staff members, to my boss? Do I disclose it to my students? Should I keep it to myself? And I've talked to other disabled academics who have just not disclosed at all, because, you know, you worry about the stigma, you worry about all the institutional implications that are going to come with it. So yeah, I think there are lots of factors in our sort of working environment that make it very difficult to be a disabled philosopher.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'll turn it over to Jonathan for the next round.
Okay, and so for our last question before we shift to some Q&A is, what actions can we take as philosophers to interrupt disabilities exclusion? We'll start with Robert.
Thank you. So there's so much to say about this. I'm going to limit myself just to one thing. And I want to take philosophers here to be a broadly inclusive term and include students who are philosophers who are. And I meet so many students who are identified neurodivergent or disabled or so forth, and increasingly so. And are frustrated that maybe they can't find supervisors because there aren't disabled philosophers with disability in tenured jobs and things like this. And it's, you know, disability and neurodiversity and so on aren't being recognized on their degrees. And I want to emphasize that students individually, of course, we don't have much power, but collectively students do have a lot of power. And I would just urge considering that. And something I was thinking of here really is the really going back to the reason there are lots of Black Studies departments in the US, and a significant part of that came from the Black Panthers organizing and demanding this, and lots of students protesting and demanding that they had like Black Studies departments back in the 1960s. Right, students do have that power if they organize and they make these demands, and that can be like, you know, through direct action, through I'm not going to be too specific in case like about what I suggest people should do. But I would really encourage students to think about organizing as well. Students do have power, but only if you organize. And if you do that, you can change your programs. You can change the things that are available to you. You can change who's on your programs, who's teaching there, right? And I really think, things aren't just going to change just because we ask nicely. And you know, obviously, disabled philosophers who are at kind of post-PhD level are also trying to fight for this in various ways, and I'm sure other people on the panel will have lots to say about that. But yeah, I just want to emphasize the potential power students have if you organize. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, so Robert talked about organizing with students and sort of student demands and activism, and I think that's really great. Some of the conversations that again, I mentioned I'm at a small undergraduate university, and some of the conversations I have with students, I'm just so excited by. Like they're so great. On a related note, I think it's also just really good and important to make kind of connections and alliances with other disciplines. There's distinct ways in which philosophy is a garbage fire. But also other disciplines are garbage fires in their own way. Like I don't know. And a lot of the fights are kind of similar fights. And I think as well, in doing that, you can kind of get some perspective in terms of changing disciplinary norms, because there's some places in which some disciplines have made some moves, or you can kind of learn from things that have worked or not worked. So I think that's really valuable. I've been really excited about work that our campus art gallery, the Owens Art Gallery at Mount Allison University, the oldest campus art gallery in Canada. I feel the need to do a little shout out. They've been doing some amazing work around access and outreach and disability education that kind of comes in part from a collaboration a few years ago that I was involved in a very, very small way, but it was kind of enough to get conversations started. And then it's like one more place where people on campus are learning about disability, learning that disability is like something really, really important. And so, you know, it kind of slowly helps shape some of the conversation. And then on that note, again, like wherever possible, sort of working with faculty unions. I know that that's something that not all institutions have. And I know in the US in particular, there's some weird quirks around whether private institutions can have that. So, but where possible, what I found in my experience is that faculty unions need some pushing on this. Like it's not necessarily always on their radar. But I mentioned before that I was sort of frustrated sometimes when I explain things to them and they still don't do the right thing. I found with faculty unions, often they do, once they do see that the case, and they do see that this is something important for members, that they do start to act on. And you can kind of, there's very specific goals that can be had about things like recognizing some of that extra work of like crib time and accommodations and so forth as like part of workload, for instance, can really sort of start to shift conversations. So I think just in general, all of those forms of like reaching out, of making alliances, which is exhausting, like, but it is some of the place where I do start to find like glimpses of hope.
Thank you, Jane. Elvis?
Yeah, I think as philosophers, we do have quite a number of opportunities to weave in disability discourses into the sort of multi-layered levels of philosophy, be it teaching, researching, and so on and so forth. So for example, I teach about 5 courses, 5 modules at my university here. That includes African philosophy, and then African philosophy for PG, hermeneutics, which we call philosophies of interpretation, understanding, epistemology, and so on. There are always opportunities to provide students with sort of lucid examples of how to apply philosophy, and what I often choose as my application would be quite a number of thematic areas, but it must include disability. So in hermeneutics, for example, I would have spent quite a number of weeks looking at hermeneutical theories, beginning with the sort of German guys, Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Heidegger, Gadamer, Derrida, but then going on to the sort of African hermeneutical cycle, Seroko-Berem, Buddhist hermeneutics, Avicenna, Al-Farabi, ideas of interpretation. So it's sort of more global hermeneutical theory. But then I start applying them to lived experiences. And then we have at least 2 weeks where we talk about interpreting the corporeal, so the body more generally, and aesthetic hermeneutics. And part of that week we'll have a discussion on the body as disgust, which is quite interesting. So giving students the opportunity to think about the body and how the body produces knowledge is very crucial. And then we do something similar in epistemology. In African philosophy, we have a whole week dedicated to African philosophy of difference and disability. And so when students who are training to be philosophers start encountering these discourses from undergraduate levels, it's very important in helping them understand that philosophy isn't this sort of abstract field, but very applied, and relates with lived experiences and sort of real life situations. And of course, as many of us already do, we feed these into sort of research, the articles and books we publish. But I think one area that we need to work a bit more on is in getting grants and funding. And this is, I think, the most perhaps difficult area, getting grants for works related to the philosophy of disability. But like what I'm trying to do at the moment is apply for a funding for philosophies of healthcare, but then find a space to weave in disability. So it's basically having it at the back of our mind for me, having it at the back of my mind that I am a philosopher, I am African, I am a disabled person, and I have to find a way to weave these all into my research, my teaching, and basically anything I do within philosophy. Yeah.
Thank you, Elvis. Julie?
So a couple things come to mind for me. One is that we have to take seriously Maeve's points about productivity and the demands of. I mean, I like Melinda. I feel like I'm slow also, but we need to redefine what counts as work. That's one of the things I recommend. And as you were just talking about too, Jane, I think. The other thing that comes to mind is we need to combat the elitism in philosophy. So I was recently talking to a big mucky muck, I won't say who he was, a big mucky muck in philosophy who gets a lot of requests to examine people for the purposes of promotion, tenure and promotion. And he was saying that what he was finding is that the really interesting work was being done at places like ours, Lehman College, small institutions, that most of the people from big places, and there are probably some people from big places here, so I don't want to say too many bad things about big places, but they have a tendency to just refer to each other and not to people who in his mind are doing the really interesting work. And so, for one time some years ago, we were hiring. I hate to tell you, the last time Lehman College hired for an open position job, we had 632 applications for one job. It was very depressing, I must say, not to mention a lot of work. But anyway, one of the young men we interviewed was specializing in development. That was his topic, and the philosophy of development. And he dropped all the big names, and I asked him, well, what do you think about Pauline Huntunji's work on development? He's like, who's Pauline Huntunji? And it's like, well, you can't do philosophy of development without actually reading some work by African philosophers who've really thought about this stuff, as well. You can't just do Martha Nussbaum and, whatever it was, the big name people that he talked about. And I think that the more we do that, I refer to anybody I find interesting, and I read all kinds of stuff, most of it not in philosophy. A colleague not too long ago said to me, I finally realized why you don't necessarily read a lot of philosophy. I'm like, but just to kind of break down that elitist structure of in terms of our references and who we read and who we refer to in our work and stuff like that. That's just one thought.
Thank you, Julie. Maeve?
Thanks. Yeah, I have 4 recommendations, but I'll be quick. So the first one on the culture of productivity. So in the UK, we have this thing called the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. I know I'm not in the UK anymore, but that's the context I know best. And it requires that academics produce a certain amount of work every 5 years. It's, it is a disciplinary practice, and I think it should be abolished. But it's not going to be abolished anytime soon, but one thing that we could do to accommodate people with disabilities is to require fewer publications of them. And I think in general, that's an accommodation we can think about requiring fewer publications from people with disabilities. Second, I think we need to do more empirical research on the experiences of disabled staff and students, and we can find recommendations through that. That's what I hope to do at my own university. And I'm very willing to connect with other people who want to do that kind of work too. So please do get in touch. But of course, it requires time and resources, right, which we often don't have. The third thing, I think there should be a fund for PhDs, postdocs, and precariously employed academics who have to take time out because of illness, because state support systems don't always step in. You don't always meet the criteria to get state benefits. And there's a lot of people, I think, falling through the pipeline at that point because they can't stay in the system because they had to take time out. And the fourth way is, you know, intellectually, philosophy has completely sidelined disability, right? It's just often just not even something that's thought about. And I think we need to talk about mainstreaming disability in the way that we talk about mainstreaming gender, because I don't think philosophy will take, you know, until philosophy as a subject takes disability seriously, I don't think it's going to take disabled philosophers seriously. So yeah, those are my 4 recommendations.
Thank you, Maeve. Melinda, I think we have a little bit of time for some Q&A.
Yeah, and as we're getting closer to the holidays, I've got my family members circling my office right now. My dog is crying. My daughter's outside waiting for me to get done. You all are probably in similar positions, so I'll try to compact or create a thread here. So many of the questions that we have in the box are deeply related to the topics that have already been raised. So I wanted to weave in the conversation that Jane started about co-authoring or collaboratively writing seems connected to a question from Rachel. So Rachel writes in the Q&A box, I am interested in the possibility of grassroots structures which might permit learning and research outside of universities, specifically for disabled people who aren't able to work full or part-time, or who are otherwise excluded from academia or would prefer to work outside of it. I've been looking at Swedish study circles as a potential model for this, open to everyone. These groups study a particular topic together, invite experts, and occasionally produce publications. I like the idea of using this model to create grassroots groups that produce research and are in dialogue with university research groups. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? So I'll briefly invite anyone to speak to that question. Elvis.
So my current book contract with Bloomsbury, it's on the book titled Doing African Philosophy Beyond Textuality and Individual Authorship, because there's a lot of emphasis within African philosophy on communitarianism or relationality or co-creation of knowledge. I think we always co-create knowledge, but we deny it at the long run. Many of us will leave this round table and write a paper because of some very interesting thoughts we got from someone, or but we'll put our name there and it becomes an individually authored knowledge. But that's not often what happens. I think the co-creation of knowledge is very important. We may deny it, but it's part of our reality. And the Palava model in African places show very clearly that African knowledges were co-created, which is why they were hardly text and they were hardly individual authors, right? So you often refer to the Akan concept of time, or the Yoruba concept of personhood, or the Zulu concept of being. And so it's always sort of referring to collectively produced knowledge about philosophical themes. So I think it's something philosophers need to, and I mean, academics need to explore a bit more. We do it. I mean, in the sciences, you can have 13, 15 people write one paper. I'm not sure why we don't do it a lot in philosophy, because perhaps because we stick very strongly to this idea of an individual thinking carefully through an idea and producing knowledge about it. and that individual not recognizing that that thinking through happened collectively, because you've obviously borrowed ideas from here and there, and you've added something to it. So I think that that question is very interesting. I think it's something I am exploring myself, and I'm very happy to hear it, basically, which is why I wanted to talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Elvis. And I wanted to point out too that we're engaged in a sort of collective knowledge producing right now. We are doing citational practice in the comment box and as we discuss, and many folks are putting really important related thoughts, including Jonathan and others, into the chat, which unfortunately I am not able to read out right now, right? But we do have the access to that chat later that maybe we could share with everyone. So additionally, Tracy asks a question that's related to this, and she writes a few remarks, and I'm going to read the question part just for the sake of time, and then ask anyone to reply to that. And so the question portion of her remarks reads like this: is there a way of leveraging this sense of collective investment we saw during COVID? That's where I hear a little bit of that connection, as a way of deepening understandings of the collective responsibility dimension of making our institutions of higher learning more accessible and inclusive? That's such a nice question to let us reflect on some of the things we've been talking about. Anyone would like to reply to that? You'd be very welcome to do so. It seems like capitalism is making use of some of the things that happened during COVID, so we can too. Robert?
Yeah, I'll go. Just so thanks. This is a really important question. I wasn't saying anything at first because I was just thinking through it, and there's so many possible things. I think it just made me think of one of the. I mean, this relates to something I've mentioned earlier about the mutual aid groups which arose during the pandemic, and lots of them disappeared, but some of them have carried on and flourished in interesting ways. And there's one near where I live. It's now called Food and Solidarity, and it's like formalized into a kind of cooperative. And they make a meal every Wednesday and feed anyone who can't afford to eat or whatever, or just wants to come. And they do related educational things as well. And that's not related to any. It's got nothing to do with any university. It was just local people, right, in this city. But it's a really nice example, I think, of how you can kind of capture those. It grew directly out of a mutual aid group that arose during the during lockdowns, basically, and was just a continuation of that. So it's just a nice example of showing how we can kind of continue those more liberatory practices that actually emerged then. I mean, I hope we can do this inside the university more too. But yeah, I just wanted to briefly add that. But my brain is kind of melting at the moment, so I've got no more thoughts at this precise moment.
Oh, Maeve.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I kind of I feel a bit pessimistic about this actually, because that sense of collective responsibility seems to have just vanished. So I can give you an example. So in my institution, there are attendance requirements for students. I have to be in class, and we check that they're in class. And for the whole of the COVID period, there was a hybrid option. So people could join online if they had COVID or if they'd been in contact with COVID. But recently it's been decided that they can't do that anymore. And I was like, well, can't we just keep that hybrid option? We know how to do it now. All of the classrooms are set up to enable that. And, if people are sick for any reason, and then they won't come in and infect other people, or if they have they need disability accommodations, or they need to be abroad for some reason, because most of our students are international, can't we just sort of let that happen? Because it's better for the community that people are accommodated, and we're not spreading illness around. And that just has not been accepted as a good idea. I just think we've forgotten the lessons of COVID very, very quickly. So I don't know, to be honest, I just don't know how to harness that sense of collective responsibility again. maybe it's going to take another massive crisis in order to do that.
Thank you so much. And I think this ties to the last question that we have, and I think we're timing this so that we have a little bit of time to talk about this as well. From Amal Salman, they write, thank you for an incredibly illuminating discussion. I hope it's okay, Amal, that I do not read out your entire comment there, but we appreciate what you're saying here, that you're just starting in your career, a master's student. And you write, quote, using your experience and everything you've learned about navigating the world of academia with a disability, how would you take advantage of the changes caused by this pandemic if you hypothetically were now in the early stages of your career? I think this opens out this question that Maeve was, exploring in a slightly different way. If anyone would like to respond, I'd be thrilled. Julie.
We've learned that you do not have to attend meetings in person. And I don't see why we, have to unlearn that. Maybe not every meeting, maybe you'd go to some, but it can save a lot of time, especially if you're in a place where I am, where commuting, the average commute is like 45 minutes to an hour, I think, in the New York City metro area. It just, and we do all our advising now online for students. And so, I think there are things we can do to take advantage of many of the technological tools that we learned about and that were developed during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Julie. I wanted to add for my own part, I was thinking a lot about the ways in which disabled folks are really best equipped to analyze the pandemic and had a lot of tools, not just for analysis in a philosophical or theoretical sense, but also like practical tools for how do we do this? How do we live together? What does it mean? Who are we? And so on. And one thing that I wish I could go back and do is be a lot more sure of myself that my lived experiences mattered to philosophy and that nobody had to authorize me as like being able to talk about disability. I mean, I adore Foucault, but the way in which I felt like I had to find like my authorization in his texts we have that authorization, and the pandemic really reminded me that it's not, we are self-authorizing, or we can be self-authorizing as disabled philosophers, disabled people, and building really crucial knowledge. And sorry for jumping sort of the line a little bit. I just wanted to share that thought because it really felt important in this moment. But I wonder if anyone else wants to add anything as we sort of wrap, because we only have a couple more moments left.
Ooh. Just very briefly, thanks. Something that happened in the pandemic has been that lots of people have begun more lots of time for self-reflection or whatever, maybe because people were kind of, in lockdown and stuff. But loads more people began identifying as neurodivergent and realizing they were really struggling in the normal pace of work and stuff like that. And I think this is really interesting because in many ways today, it's a lot less lonely being a neurodivergent person in philosophy or elsewhere than it was even just a couple of years ago. And it's becoming less so all the time, but this gives us, again, more power for organizing. And I want to say, if you're a master's student right now, find these other people who are disabled and neurodivergent, who are identifying with that, who are also students, right? Connect with them, organize with them again. Not just organize, as I said earlier, to actually demand that to change the way universities work, but just organize so you can support each other, have support networks and care webs and so forth. And this is opened up a bit more by the pandemic, and I think that's really important. That's certainly what I would do.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this panel. Jonathan, thank you for your partnership. And I will sign off and we maybe go to Shelley. Jonathan, do you want to say anything before we go to Shelley?
No, absolutely. Thank you all for participating in the panel and for your wonderful insights. I learned a lot, and hopefully everyone else did. And I'm quite happy to have this wonderful group of scholars to work with.
Thank you very much for this. It's hard to put into words just, what this panel has done, I think. And the activity in the chat, it's just been way it's surpassed what I had even hoped for with respect to this panel, with respect to this workshop. I'm just I just don't know how to. I mean, it's a good thing that there isn't a session afterwards, because this would be impossible to follow. So I want to thank everyone involved in the panel. Melinda, Jonathan, you did a tremendous job, as I knew you would. And Maeve, Robert, Julie, Jane, thank you so much for participating. Maeve, and just I'm so glad that this is the way that we are ending the conference this year. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming and participating. You've been tremendous, community members. Jamie, as always, I want to thank you for the tremendous job that you've done, facilitating the tech, operating the tech. This as I've said to you a number of times recently, this population, how we operate, like things are not going to go the way other conferences do, but you like go with it. And I'm so appreciative. So, and to Jonathan, my, co-coordinator of a co-organizer of this conference, thank you very much. To everyone, have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.